"You need to stop crying, Avery. This is exactly what I warned them about." The words came from across the courtroom while my husband sat there in a pressed navy suit with his hand resting on our 5-year-old son's shoulder, like I was a threat standing 10 feet away instead of the boy's mother. Mason kept looking between us with the confused expression children wear when the adults around them are performing emotions he doesn't have the language for yet. "I'm not crying because I'm unstable," I said. My voice shook anyway. "I'm crying because you're lying." The judge barely looked up before Preston's lawyer rose from his seat. "Your Honor, given Mrs. Hale's emotional volatility today, we're formally requesting an emergency psychological evaluation before custody proceedings continue." And then his mother sighed loudly from the front row. "Oh, thank God," Diane breathed, just loud enough for the 3 rows around her to hear. "Someone is finally taking this seriously." The entire courtroom turned toward me. Not Preston. Not Diane. Me. Like I was dangerous. Like I was broken. Like 7 years of my life had been rewritten while I was still living them. "My name is Avery Hale. I'm 28 years old. 3 months before that courtroom hearing, I still believed my marriage could be saved. I had no idea my husband and his mother had been quietly, methodically building a case against me for months. And I had no idea that the very evaluation they were demanding would be the thing that destroyed them. The first sign wasn't dramatic. Never is. It was a dinner party at Diane's house in October. She stood at the head of the table refilling wine glasses with that particular grace she had always deployed in public, and she said it lightly, almost as an aside. "Avery's been so forgetful lately. Honestly, sometimes I worry about her." 2 people laughed softly. A third touched my arm sympathetically. Nobody looked at Preston. But I looked at him. He lowered his eyes and said, "She's under a lot of stress." Something cold settled in my stomach. Not anger. Something quieter and more precise than that. Because 2 nights earlier I had forgotten to pick up Preston's dry cleaning after working a 12-hour shift. Small thing. The kind of small thing that happens when a person is exhausted. But Preston had stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me for 10 full seconds before saying quietly, "Do you think you're okay lately?" Not concerned. Measured. I lay awake that night replaying the question in the dark beside him. And I started thinking about the other small moments. The coffee I left on the roof of the car. The school permission slip I sent in a day late. The evening I cried from tiredness and he had stood in the doorway watching me instead of coming closer. None of it had felt random until that moment. Lying there in the dark, it started feeling like a pattern that someone else had already noticed and was already naming. Preston became perfect in public. That was the thing that made it so hard to explain to anyone. He was attentive and gentle and visibly devoted. He insisted on driving me places because I was tired. He answered questions on my behalf at gatherings before I could speak. He placed his hand on my lower back in a way that looked supportive from across the room. "Breathe, Ave," he would say softly when I started to respond to something. In front of people. In a tone that implied I was always seconds from losing control. If I reacted with frustration, I looked unstable. If I stayed quiet and let it pass, people pitied me. There was no version of my response that didn't confirm what he was building. Then one afternoon I came home from an errand and heard Diane in the kitchen talking to our neighbor. "She's fragile," Diane was saying. Soft voice. Genuine sounding concern. "We're just trying to protect little Mason." I stood in the hallway gripping the grocery bag so hard the plastic handles cut into my fingers. Protect him. From me. I was his mother. I had been his mother every morning for 5 years. I was the one who knew which stuffed rabbit he needed at night and what sounds meant he was actually sick versus just tired. I was the one who had been there, consistently, through every ordinary and difficult day. And now the word fragile was being attached to me in conversations I wasn't part of. That afternoon, confusion finished and fear began. I took Mason to his routine pediatric appointment alone on a Tuesday in November. The doctor was kind and careful in the way good pediatricians are. She checked Mason thoroughly, asked him questions, made him laugh. Then, near the end of the appointment, She set down her pen and looked at me with the careful expression of someone who has been asked to deliver something gently. "Are you getting enough support at home?" she asked. I stared at her. "Your husband called ahead," she said. She chose her words deliberately. "He mentioned you've been struggling emotionally lately. He wanted me to be aware." The room tilted. Preston had called our son's doctor. Without telling me. Had spoken about me to a medical professional who was now looking at me with clinical attention, before I even walked through the door. I managed to finish the appointment. I got Mason into his car seat. I pulled out of the car park and drove 2 minutes before I had to pull over because my hands were shaking too badly to continue. That evening I confronted Preston directly. He stayed calm. He always stayed calm. That was the thing about him that I had once loved and now understood differently. "I was worried about you," he said. "You told our son's doctor I was unstable." "No," he replied. Soft voice. Steady eyes. "I said you've been overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. Like the word was a kindness. Like the word wasn't being placed carefully in a file. A credit card declined at the supermarket checkout on a Wednesday afternoon. I laughed for the benefit of the people behind me in the queue and assumed it was a fraud alert. Those happened sometimes. I paid with a different card and didn't think much of it until I got home and checked the accounts. 3 of them were significantly reduced. Not emptied. Not enough to be immediately catastrophic. Just enough that I noticed and felt the floor shift slightly. I waited until Mason was in bed, and then went to the kitchen where Preston was working at the table and told him what I had found. He looked up. His expression was perfectly arranged into surprise. "That's impossible," he said. But later that evening I walked past the office and the door was ajar and I could see the screen of his laptop. He closed it quickly when he registered my presence. Not guiltily, just smoothly. The way a person closes something they don't want seen. The following morning Diane called. "You really need to get on top of your spending, sweetheart," she said. Her voice had that warm concern in it that she was very good at producing. I went very still. Preston must have told her before I had even confronted him. Which meant the conversation about the accounts had been anticipated. Which meant the reduction wasn't an accident or a mistake or a billing error. It was deliberate. And Diane already knew the explanation before I discovered the problem. I found the voice recorder by accident. I was looking for a pen on Preston's office shelf and knocked a stack of books sideways. The recorder fell from behind them and landed on the carpet. It was small and black and the kind of device you wouldn't notice unless it was out of place. I assumed it was work-related at first. Preston handled sensitive client meetings sometimes and recorded them for reference. I almost put it back. Then I pressed play. And heard myself crying. My voice. In my own home. During an argument from 2 weeks earlier, when I had been exhausted from a long week and said things that were honest but not composed. I heard myself. Then I heard Preston's voice after my crying had quietened, saying something that had not been part of the argument I remembered. He said it quietly, as though to himself, or to someone else he was imagining. "See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Not comforting me. Not responding to me. Documenting me. Using my worst moment as evidence for a case he was building while I was inside it." I put the recorder back exactly where I had found it and left the office and walked to the kitchen and ran cold water over my wrists at the sink. Because now I knew it wasn't paranoia. Now I knew it was real. People started pulling away. Quietly, individually, in ways I could almost explain away if I tried. A friend didn't return 2 calls. Another canceled lunch and then canceled again and stopped suggesting alternatives. At Mason's school pickup, conversations ended slightly too quickly when I arrived. I told myself it was just the season. Everyone was busy. People lost touch for ordinary reasons. Then my Aunt Florence called. She was my mother's older sister and had been one of the most consistent presences in my life for as long as I could remember. She asked to come for coffee. I made it, and we sat at the kitchen table, and she covered my hand with hers and said, "Honey, have you thought about maybe taking some time for yourself?" I looked at her. You think I'm unstable too, I said. It wasn't a question. Her silence confirmed it before she could form an answer. That night after Mason was asleep, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried in the way that doesn't make much noise because you're keeping it contained. Outside the door after a while, Preston knocked softly. Avery, he said. His voice was gentle enough to sound loving from the hallway. You're frightening people. I sat on the cold tiles and understood something completely. He wasn't watching to help me. He was watching to record what he needed next. Preston left his laptop at home one Thursday. I was not looking for anything when it opened on the desk. The screen woke when I moved past it and a folder was already visible on the desktop. Custody notes. My heart dropped somewhere below where hearts are supposed to sit. Opened it. Inside were dated entries. Organized. Going back 7 months. They were descriptions of my behavior, framed as observations but constructed with language designed to sound clinical. Medical-adjacent phrasing around ordinary moments. Cried following argument. Raised voice in kitchen. Appeared disorganized at school function. Failed to return school forms on scheduled date. Every entry was technically accurate in the way a photograph taken at the worst angle is technically accurate. A document of real moments, stripped of context, arranged to build a portrait of a woman who was deteriorating. Then I found Diane's messages at the bottom of the folder. You need more examples before court. Stay calm when she reacts. Judges pay attention to emotional women. I sat in front of that screen for a long time. 7 months. This had been running for 7 months. While I cooked dinner and drove Mason to football practice and held Preston's hand at his office functions and tried to save a marriage I thought was worth saving. He had been building a legal strategy to take my son. I found the prescription bottle in my bathroom drawer on a Monday morning. I opened the drawer for paracetamol and found a bottle I didn't recognize, with a pharmacy label that had my name and a prescription date from 6 weeks earlier. I had never been prescribed this medication. I had never visited the doctor who had written it. I had never set foot in the pharmacy that had dispensed it. My knees went soft. I called the pharmacy immediately. The pharmacist confirmed the prescription had been transferred from another location and processed 6 weeks earlier. When I asked who had authorized the transfer, she checked the file and said it had been requested by my husband on my behalf. I drove to Preston's office. I know I shouldn't have. I know that walking into his workplace shaking with rage was exactly the kind of moment he had been engineering. But I went because there is only so much a person can hold before the body simply moves. When I came through the door, his colleagues looked up. Preston stood slowly from his desk. He looked at me across the open-plan office with a careful expression that communicated concern to everyone watching. Avery, he said quietly. Please don't do this here. And just like that, I was exactly the picture he had been drawing. Disruptive. Emotional. Unable to manage herself in a professional environment. I walked out. My hands were shaking the entire drive home. The first attorney barely listened. She had the organized manner of a professional who had heard too many variations of too many difficult situations and had learned to manage her own response. She took notes. She asked practical questions. When I finished explaining, she folded her hands. Family courts prioritize stability, she said carefully. You need to avoid emotional reactions. Anything that validates his characterization of you will be used. I almost laughed. How was I supposed to stay emotionally controlled while someone systematically dismantled my life? Then she said something that changed the temperature of the room. Your husband has already filed affidavits from multiple witnesses. Multiple witnesses. For a custody proceeding that hadn't even formally begun yet. I walked to my car in the gray afternoon car park and sat behind the steering wheel for a long time. This was not a husband who had decided to leave and had made choices about how to leave. This was a campaign. Had been running for months. It had witnesses and documentation and strategy. It had been built while I was still inside the marriage trying to fix something I didn't yet understand was not broken by accident. Preston had started this war before I even knew we were fighting. Diane hosted a family dinner and called it a chance to talk peacefully. I knew it was something else the moment I walked in and saw the arrangement of the seating. Diane at one end, Preston beside her, and a careful gap left for me on the opposite side where I would be visible to everyone at the table. We were halfway through the main course when Diane looked at me directly and said, in a warm, curious voice, "Avery, do you think motherhood has been harder on you than you expected?" The table went quiet. Preston watched me, completely still, the way a person waits to see what a camera captures. I looked at Diane, took a breath, smiled. "No harder than marriage," I said. Her expression tightened for a fraction of a second. Nobody else would have caught it, but it was there. I excused myself to collect my coat earlier than everyone expected. In the hallway, I heard Preston behind me speaking to his brother in a low voice. "She's getting smarter about what she says." He didn't sound pleased. He sounded warned. And that terrified me more than the dinner table performance had, because it told me he had been studying my behavior closely enough to notice the moment I started becoming strategic. He had recognized the shift before I had even fully made it. The court order for the psychological evaluation arrived on a Tuesday. Mandatory, expedited, formal. I read the paperwork 3 times at the kitchen table before I went to the sink and was sick. Preston appeared in the doorway while I was rinsing my mouth. He leaned against the frame with his arms lightly crossed and said, "I know this feels unfair." I dried my hands and looked at him across the kitchen. "You did this." "No," he replied. The same tone he had been using for months. Measured and soft and utterly certain of itself. "Your behavior did." That sentence sat in my chest like something physical. Because the most terrifying thing about prolonged manipulation is not the individual moments. It's the accumulation. Month after month of being told that the problem is you, being watched for evidence that the problem is you, being isolated from the people who might tell you that it isn't you. It starts to work. Not completely, but enough. I sat at the table after he left the kitchen and tried to locate the person I had been before this. The one who knew her own mind and trusted her own perceptions and didn't flinch before speaking. She was still there. I could find her when I looked. But she was quieter than she used to be. And I understood, sitting at that table, that getting her back was now the most important thing. Dr. Nadia Okonkwo was the court-appointed evaluator. She didn't smile much. She had an office with 2 chairs at the same level and no desk between her and the person she was speaking with, which I noticed because it was different from the power arrangements most professionals use without realizing it. She watched quietly. She took notes in a small notebook rather than on a screen. I answered her questions for nearly 2 hours. She asked about my childhood, my work, my marriage, my parenting, my daily routines, my friendships. She asked in the careful, open-ended way that gives you room to explain rather than just confirm. Then she asked the one question that changed the shape of the room. "When did your husband first begin describing you to others as emotionally unstable?" Not if, when. She already knew there was a when. She had either identified it through what I had told her, or through something she had found through independent inquiry. Either way, the question assumed the behavior existed and was asking me to place it on a timeline. For the first time in months, someone in a professional context was operating from the assumption that my account was plausible. I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt for a very long time. Someone believed me. A bank notice arrived at the house addressed to Preston. I only saw it because it fell from the pile of mail onto the kitchen floor and landed face up. Final warning. Past due amount in bold at the top. The figure was $418,000. I picked it up and read it twice and then set it carefully back in the pile. The failing real estate investment Preston had described to everyone, including me, as thriving and promising and nearly ready to return. It was collapsing. Had been collapsing for some time, based on what the notice suggested about the arrears. I sat down at the kitchen table and the whole architecture of the last 7 months rearranged itself into a different shape. If we divorced through a standard process, financial discovery would be mandatory. Everything would be examined. The hidden loans, the debts, the transfers, the real state of his business. All of it would be visible to both attorneys and the court. But if I was discredited first, If I was labeled unstable and unreliable and emotionally compromised, then anything I said during proceedings could be dismissed as the claims of a woman who couldn't be trusted. This wasn't about custody. Not really. Custody was the mechanism. Discrediting me was the goal. Because a discredited woman can't testify credibly about what she found in her own kitchen. Mason's teacher stopped me after school pickup on a Thursday afternoon. Her name was Ms. Adissa, and she had been teaching his class for 2 years. She had that specific competence of primary school teachers who know each child individually and fully and are not easily fooled about what a child is actually experiencing. She asked if she could have a brief word. "I just wanted to say," she said carefully. "He talks about you constantly. Drawing time. During circle. When he's describing his favorite things." He paused. "He seems happiest when he describes time with you." He nodded. My throat was tight. Then she hesitated in the way people do when they are deciding whether to say the next thing. "Some of what your husband implied during our meeting last month didn't match what I observe in Mason at all," she said. She chose each word precisely. "I thought you should know that." She went back inside before I could find a response. I stood in the school car park for a moment. Preston had spoken to Ms. Adissa, added her to the list of people who had been approached, briefed, carefully prepared to see me through a particular lens. The same way he had approached the pediatrician. The same way he had approached my aunt. But Ms. Adissa had not been persuaded. The picture he was painting had its first crack. One of Preston's friends called me on a Saturday morning from a number I didn't recognize. His name was Felix, and he had known Preston since university. He had been at our wedding. He had been at the dinner parties and the birthday celebrations and all the ordinary occasions of our shared life. His voice on the phone was unsteady in the specific way of someone who has made a decision that frightens them. "I can't testify for him," he said. I agreed because he told me it was straightforward. But what he's asking me to say, it's not what I actually saw. I sat down on the edge of the bed and listened. He said Preston had been in contact with him multiple times. He had given him specific language to use. Specific memories to describe in specific ways. He had framed it as helping the court understand the full picture. Then Felix forwarded me screenshots. Messages between Preston and Diane spanning several weeks that detailed which witnesses to approach, what to ask them to say, how to frame observations so they would carry legal weight, and how to handle it if anyone pushed back. Hands were shaking when I forwarded everything to my new attorney. The picture Preston had been painting was not just built from his own actions. It was coordinated, organized, directed from the outside by his mother and executed systematically across every person in my life. And now someone inside that system had decided to walk out of it. Anonymous posts started appearing in a local parenting social media group. Vague, careful, never using my name, but specific enough in detail that anyone who knew our situation would understand immediately. Phrases like "some mothers create unstable environments." References to children needing protection from emotional unpredictability. I found them on a Tuesday evening after Mason was in bed. I sat with the phone in my hands and read through comments from strangers who were sympathizing with a version of my life I didn't recognize. Then I looked at the timestamps. Every post had appeared within a short window following specific events. One appeared the evening after court documents were filed. Another appeared the morning after Diane had attended a charity breakfast that 2 of my friends also attended. I went back further and found a pattern. Every anonymous post saw my elated with Diane's social schedule. She wasn't just supporting Preston's legal strategy. She was running a separate campaign through community channels, seeding my reputation with damage that couldn't be traced directly back to anyone. She was doing this deliberately and she was enjoying it. That was the part that took my breath away when it fully landed. Not the cruelty itself. The enjoyment. This was not someone acting out of misguided love for her son. This was someone who had found an outlet for something that had always been in her. And my vulnerability had given her the perfect occasion for it. Dr. Okonkwo requested a second meeting. She called my attorney's office to arrange it rather than contacting me directly, which was formal in a way her first meeting hadn't been. When I arrived, she was already at her desk. She closed the door and sat down and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. She asked whether anyone connected to my husband or his legal team had tried to contact me about withdrawing from the custody proceedings. I said there had been pressure. Diane's conversations. The anonymous posts. Preston's offer several weeks earlier to settle if I agreed to reduced custody terms. She nodded and slid a piece of paper across her desk. A formal complaint had been submitted to the evaluation board about her handling of my case. Anonymous. It had been received before our first meeting was even finished. Someone had tried to have her removed before she could complete her assessment. The room went very quiet. I looked at the complaint and then at her. Someone is trying to influence the evaluation from the outside, I said. Someone did try, she replied. It was reviewed and dismissed. But it tells us something about the level of organization involved. A pause. This is no longer just a custody dispute, Mrs. Hale. Already knew. But hearing someone in an official capacity say it made it real in a different way. For 7 months, Preston had been composed. That was the foundation of everything he had built. His steadiness against my visible distress. His calm voice against my shaking one. Every single moment of my emotion set against his control, carefully staged and carefully witnessed. Then I refused to sign the temporary custody modification his attorney had requested, and the mask came off. He called me from downstairs while I was putting Mason to bed. I came down to find him standing in the kitchen with the document on the counter, and an expression I had never seen fully before. Everything underneath the performance finally visible. You are ruining everything, he said. Not our family. Not Mason's life. Not our marriage. Everything. And in that single word I heard the full shape of what this had always been about. His business. His debt. His exposure. His carefully constructed reputation. Everything he had built that was about to come apart in financial proceedings if I remained credible enough to testify. The second he heard himself, fear moved across his face. He looked down. He picked up the document. He left the kitchen without saying anything further. But I had already heard it. And I was not the only one. Mason's baby monitor was clipped to my belt from when I had carried it downstairs. The recording function had been on. Diane cornered me in the courthouse corridor after a preliminary hearing. She waited until the attorneys had separated, and we were briefly alone in the gray corridor with the vending machine humming at the end of it. She appeared beside me and took my arm above the elbow in a grip that was firm without being something you could describe as aggressive. You could make this so much easier, she said. Her voice was low. Walk away from the full custody claim now before people hear worse things about you. I looked at her. Worse than the things you invented, said. Her expression did something underneath its surface. A tightening that she controlled quickly but not quickly enough. Then she leaned slightly closer and said the sentence that would matter later. No one believes a mother once the word unstable has been attached to her. It doesn't wash off. She said it like a fact, like a law, like something she had always known and had deployed with confidence in situations before this one. She let go of my arm and walked away toward where Preston was speaking with his attorney. I stood still. Because a few steps behind us, seated on the corridor bench with a coffee and a phone she was no longer looking at, was my attorney's assistant, who had heard every word. Preston's financial records entered the court discovery process on a Wednesday. His attorney had been fighting the disclosure request for 3 weeks. When the judge ruled in favor of full financial discovery, I was not in the courtroom, but my attorney called me immediately. She said Preston's lawyer had gone pale reading the scope of the order. Hidden loan structures. Property transfers processed under a second company name that had not been disclosed. A signature on a financial document that had been flagged by the forensic accountant my attorney had engaged as inconsistent with Preston's known signature pattern. Diane, sitting in the gallery for every hearing, looked genuinely pale for the first time. Preston looked at me across the courtroom with an expression I had not seen from him in the entire process. Not confidence. not calculation. He looked like a man who had been certain of the outcome for so long that he had never seriously prepared for another one. Bullies, I had come to understand, always assume that fear is permanent. They build their strategies on the assumption that the person they are targeting will remain exactly as vulnerable as they were at the beginning. They don't account for what happens when that person stops being afraid. The psychological evaluation report was submitted to the court on a Friday morning, sealed. I was not permitted to see it before it was opened in the courtroom. Neither was Preston. He walked into the hearing smiling. Not broadly. The contained smile of a man who believes he has won and is trying to wear his victory with appropriate discretion. Diane sat behind him with her hands folded and the posture of someone who has been confident for so long it has become physical. Our attorneys sat on opposite sides. The judge reviewed documents from the morning's submission. Then the evaluation report was opened. Preston's attorney received the copy first. He read it. He did not look up when he finished. He did not arrange his expression into anything communicative. He simply set it down on the table in front of him and looked at the surface of the wood. Not concerned. Not neutral. Something that had no performance left in it. That was the moment I knew. Not when the judge spoke. Not when the ruling was announced. That moment, watching Preston's attorney set down a piece of paper and stop performing, was when I understood that the story they had built around me for 7 months had finally met something it could not reshape. The truth, stated by a professional with no stake in either version, in language that could not be edited or framed or recontextualized by anyone in that room. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system above the ceiling tiles. The judge adjusted her glasses and began reading sections aloud. Each sentence landed in the room like something being placed carefully on a surface. Mrs. Hale demonstrates no indicators of psychological instability or parental risk. Diane stopped moving. Preston's face emptied in the specific way that faces empty when all the energy being used to maintain an expression is suddenly required elsewhere. The judge was not finished. The evaluation notes a pattern consistent with prolonged coercive psychological manipulation directed against Mrs. Hale, characterized by systematic social isolation, deliberate reputation damage, and coordinated narrative construction designed to destabilize the subject's sense of reality and credibility. The room shifted. Not just in attention. In orientation. The people who had been watching me, to see how I would react, to assess my stability, to confirm the portrait that had been circulating for 7 months, turned. They turned toward Preston. He sat very still at his table. His attorney had his head slightly down. Diane had both hands pressed flat on her thighs. And I sat with my hands in my lap and my breathing steady and let the words continue, because this was what I had been working toward since the night I listened to that recording in the dark and understood what was being done to me. Preston tried to interrupt the hearing twice. The first time his attorney pulled him back by the arm. The second time the judge spoke to him directly and he subsided. Then came the testimony from Preston's former business partner, submitted through written affidavit because he had agreed to cooperate with a financial investigation in exchange for reduced personal liability. He stated plainly that Preston had told him directly, in a conversation the partner had documented at the time, that he needed Avery to be formally assessed as unstable before the financial investigation could gain traction. The word before. Before. Not during. Not after. The psychological evaluation push had preceded the financial exposure. It had been planned as the first move in a sequence specifically designed to remove my credibility before my credibility became a problem for him. Everything detonated in the room at once. The voice recorder. The prescription. The coordinated witnesses. The anonymous posts. Diane's corridor statement, relayed by my attorney's assistant in a sworn affidavit. The forged financial signature. The complaint filed against Dr. Okonkwo before the evaluation was complete. Assembled together, they told a story about a campaign. Not a husband's grief or a family's concern. A deliberate, coordinated, multi-month campaign to destroy my credibility and remove me from my son's life before the truth about the money could surface. Preston looked at me across the courtroom. For the first time in the entire process, I could see that he was afraid. The judge awarded me primary custody. She did it in language that was formal and precise and left no interpretive space. She noted the evaluation findings. She noted the financial disclosure and the ongoing investigation. She noted the coordinated witness coaching evidenced by the screenshot record Felix had provided. Diane cried, loudly without composure, in the front row of the gallery where she had sat performing concern and certainty for months. Preston sat at his table and looked at the surface of it while investigators from the Financial Oversight Authority waited in the corridor outside the courtroom doors. My attorney had informed me they were there. I had not told Preston. I took Mason's hand when he was brought into the room by the court welfare officer, and I held it, and I did not look at Preston or Diane. The judge spoke one final sentence as we rose to leave. This court finds that Mr. Hale deliberately weaponized mental health allegations against his wife for personal financial gain, in a pattern that constitutes a serious abuse of the family court process. I walked out of that courtroom holding my son's hand. Mason looked up at me and asked if we were going home now. Told him yes. And behind us, the doors closed on the version of my life that Preston and Diane had spent 7 months trying to write. The version where I was fragile, where I couldn't be trusted, where I needed to be managed and documented and reduced. That version had required an enormous amount of effort to build. It had taken considerably less time to dismantle. Because the thing about the truth, the actual documented, witnessed, professionally assessed truth, is that it doesn't need anyone's permission to stand.